The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Welcome to Gate City Chronicles. I'm Kevin Avard, your host, and today we have a special author, and we're going to be looking at a topic from a different perspective. We're going to talk about a book. It's called Flight of Remembrance, written by Marina Dutzmann Kirsch.
Yes.
And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much,
Glad to
Kevin.
have you. And tell me a little bit about your dress real quickly. It was striking. As soon as I walked into the studio, I noticed it, and you have the sash, and it's elegant, and at the same time, it doesn't look like it's something that you would buy at tailor's or whatever.
It's definitely not from this time period.
Right.
It's actually a dress from 1930s Latvia that was hand-tailored and embroidered by my grandmother Maria, my father's mother. And she altered it when I was a teenager. Fortunately, it still fits after all these years.
Sure.
And the embroidery pattern is actually a Latvian pattern. So she made it in Latvia, and it's been confirmed by a costume museum in the city of Riga as being an authentic Latvian pattern.
Interesting. Now, for us that are
I
ignorant,
want to show the sleeves.
for those that are that don't know where Latvia is, where is it in relationship to Germany and Poland?
It is northeast. So if you go up the coast of the Baltic Sea from Germany, and you'll go by a tiny sliver of Poland, and then you'll come to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And those three Baltic states were part of the vast Tsarist Russian Empire way back when. But as soon as the Russian Revolution occurred, those three countries attained a tenuous independence. And it was at that point, actually, that my grandfather was born and raised in Latvia. But he was a Tsarist Russian officer during World War I, was taken prisoner of war by Germany. He was also an outspoken anti-Soviet, so anti-communist,
Even though he was
between
a
the
Tsar.
world wars. Well, he served under the Tsarist Russian Empire in the First World War. Then he served for the independent Republic of Latvia in between the two world wars, and was an outspoken anti-communist. But at that time, there were a lot of communists already, communist supporters in all of the Baltic states.
What was driving the communist doctrine, or what was pushing that? Was it economics, or what was the state of the country to want to start absorbing that?
Well, communism is an economic system, and they definitely wanted the Baltic states back. So the Soviets made every attempt after World War I ended still. Germany and the Soviet Union were both battling over the Baltic states. And the reason for the Soviet Union was that the Baltic states were their outlet to the Baltic Sea. They had none.
Right, they needed
So
that access.
getting the Baltic states back was very important to them. So when they first came in, it was 1940. My father and his family had to flee Latvia because the Soviets were coming. With my grandfather having been a very young, by the way, Tsarist Russian officer, and then working also as a Latvian officer. He was an engineer in a munitions laboratory on the Baltic Sea between the two world wars. And being an outspoken anti-communist, they had to get out.
So from communism into this socialism, well, I believe Nazis were part of the Socialist Party.
It was fascism.
Fascism, social, but didn't it start off as a socialist party?
Well, the name of it was Sozialnationalistische There was a German term for it.
Right.
So, but it really, to my mind, was not socialism.
So in America, somebody says, oh, well, that's fascist. Well, what does it mean? What does fascism mean?
Well, fascism usually includes a dictator, like Hitler or Mussolini. Stalin, well, he's considered a Soviet dictator, but they basically have mostly very little regard for the people. And the 20th century was just rife with fascism. And the thing is, in places like Poland and the Baltic states, they were wedged in between these two brutal regimes. And a lot of people here in the US don't realize that there were German-speaking people, so people of German heritage, scattered all over the face of Europe. And they faced execution or deportation usually under a Soviet takeover. So for my family, my father's family, there was no question what they needed to do. And just before they fled, there's one picture shown of my father, my grandmother, and my father's sister. My father at the time was 20 years old, was studying aeronautical engineering at the University of Riga. That was his dream. His overarching goal in life was to further the field of aeronautical engineering, which, remember, aviation was very young at that time. And just about every young man and a lot of young women had a dream about furthering that in some way.
Earhart and...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, but there's a picture of them, and when I show it, I always talk about the fact that Rolf had to leave all of that behind and go into the situation where he didn't know what was going to happen after the family arrived in Nazi Germany, which was the only place that they could relocate to.
This now, just a little bit about the book. The book is a World War II memoir of love and survival.
Yes.
And basically, those that were basically forced into German life, the army, I believe.
Yes, well, the story includes two German veterans, which a lot of Americans find interesting because they don't know too much about what it was like to serve on the other side. And also, what was it like to live through a war on the losing side where the main part of the war was waged on your own home soil. So the background of my book actually has a scene of devastation. It's the ruined family home in Berlin. And the only reason we have those is my father was able to take bombing leave. He was drafted into the German Luftwaffe. His father, my grandfather, very skilled electrical engineer,
and the Luftwaffe
was drafted into the Wehrmacht. Luftwaffe was
the
German Air Force.
Right.
The Wehrmacht was the German Army.
Wehrmacht.
Now, my grandfather was so highly skilled that as soon as the regime caught wind of his skills, they decided to not only draft him, but to send him to Peenemünde to work with Wernher von Braun on V-2 rocket inspection. So they were developing the V-2 rocket at that highly classified installation, which didn't remain top secret for long. It was bombed in August of 1943. And then after that, my grandfather in 1944 was sent to the top secret installation of Mittelwerk, which was deep in the Harz Mountain region of Germany, which hadn't yet been bombed. And it was an underground installation.
Was he aware of what was going on? I mean, you couldn't protest, otherwise it would cost you your life.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, one thing to remember is the difficult situation that a lot of people, including my father's family, were in. Now, on my mother's side, it was different. She was born and raised in Germany. She had a different vantage point, but she was very young when Hitler came to power, only 12 or 13 years old. But on my father's side of the family, I wish I could call my grandfather back. He had an incredible intellect, and you can't tell by the photograph that I'm going to send you to show, but he had an incredible sense of humor, wonderful sense of humor. And if I could ask him all the questions now that I would like to ask, he would give amazing answers. But as it was, he hardly talked about his wartime experience. And when I began to find out what his service was all about, and the fact that there was a huge slave labor camp at the gates of the Mittelbau Dora at the Mitovac installation called Mittelbaudora, where 20,000 inmates died over the course of a year and a half. I was horrified to find that out.
Were they Jewish or were they
No. Now here's the interesting part. How much did my grandfather even know about the Holocaust, about death camps, about genocide? I'm not sure he did, because in both installations where he worked, there were camps associated with both of them, and the Mittelbaudora camp was the larger, by far, of the two. There were hardly any Jewish inmates until at the very end of the war, when, sadly, the Jewish population had already mostly been murdered by that time. But they sent Jews from Hungary to the camp. However, did he know that genocide had been perpetrated in Poland? I have no idea. And I wish I could ask him now.
We were talking about off air that not everybody had a radio.
Right. Not everybody had a radio. And during the war, I don't even know if my grandfather got radio reports. And you could not listen to Radio Moscow, the Voice of America, or the BBC. You would threaten your own life. You would be sent literally to a camp or possibly executed if you listened to any of the news reports from the other side. So all you could listen to was a German propaganda. Now, I suspect that my grandfather did know, because I found out a lot about my grandfather's work during the war from books. I found out he's mentioned in many books. I thought I was done with writing my book. And then I Googled his name. And I found out, oh my goodness, Grandpa is mentioned in books. So I had to buy all the books. I had to go online. I even found doctoral dissertations written about the situation at Peenemünde, the atmosphere at the installation of Peenemünde and at Mitovac, and what that was all about.
And what was that all
like.
about? What was it like? I mean, for somebody to...
Well, at
obviously
Peenemünde, that was a top-notch, state-of-the-art development center, such as had never been seen anywhere in the world, where they first developed the V1, the V2, and who knows what else. And that's where my grandfather was first sent. But then they needed to mass produce those rockets, and they had to do it in a much safer location that the Allies hadn't yet discovered. So that was done in the Harz Mountain region, in the center of Germany. And I found out that there were 3 inmates working in my grandfather's department, which was the most technical department in the installation. He had 200 civilian and Army engineers working under him and 3 inmates. One of them said in his post-war transcripts that he and my grandfather had developed a great friendship. Now, very unusual. A Nazi officer, my grandfather was a major in the Wehrmacht, and an inmate. But nevertheless, they did, and they shared a lot of things together, as this inmate, Yuri Benish. He was a Czech, probably partisan or a resistance fighter. The people sent to the camps, like I said, not Jews, not gypsies, not gays and whoever, and almost all were men. Most of them were resistance fighters and partisans from the countries with which Germany was at war.
I met a gypsy. She had the...
Yeah, you could almost say, okay, that's an accepted part of war, but not the conditions under which they toiled, enslaved, and died. Almost 20,000 died in a year and a half. My grandfather arrived in February. By that time, a lot of deaths had occurred before that, when they expanded the underground tunnel system. When my grandfather arrived, they had already built above-ground housing.
Did he write about this at all?
No. He never wrote, never spoke. This was a journey of discovery for me and for my father, my grandfather's son, to uncover all this information, much of it in the German language, in books written in German and so on, which my father helped me with a lot before he passed away. It was a wonderful thing that my father and I shared, finding out more about my grandfather's work, and the fact that he not only befriended one of the inmates, but that he helped protect all 3 of them from the intrusions of the SS. The SS were deeply feared in the underground tunnel system because they were brutal in their tactics. And by the way, 20,000 inmates dying in that installation, that's about 3 times as many fatalities as people in Europe dying from the V2 being launched against European cities. So what does that tell you? I mean, it's
The
just an
totality.
incredible statistic.
And so this journey here, you start us off in the beginning where, what was the inception of this, of coming to write this?
Well, there were a lot of items of inspiration, not only this dress. Oh, this brooch, by the way, is from the southwestern part of Latvia, the Kurzem region near the Baltic Sea where my family is from, and it probably belonged to my great-grandmother. But in addition to that, I have used 132 photographs in the book, so we have an incredible archive. Those inspired me ever since I was a child. I would look at those and I would think, wow, just beautiful, beautiful photographs. Then in addition, letters. We have many of the wartime letters that my father wrote to my mother. They're all preserved. We have family documents. And we have what to me was the most amazing thing, a family history written by my parents, Rolf and Lilo, in the early 1990s. They gave us a family history that was thicker than this book, but it was actually typed on an old-fashioned typewriter and then copied. But they gave us that volume, and after I read it, I thought, wow, I have to do something with this someday. My first thought was a film, so I took a movie treatment course, and there was a question raised there by another student. He said, but it's a story about Nazis. And I have to almost be grateful that someone came right out with that. Not everyone would be so frank. I thought to myself, okay,
It's not
is
celebrating
the
what they're...
timing right, or will it ever be right for a story about German people during World War II?
It's not a celebration of Nazis.
No,
It's a
not at
historical,
all.
clinical look at the times, and some people were forced into it. I mean, every documentary I've seen, not everybody was necessarily involved with it, but if you didn't, some of the brown shirts, from what I understand, they were pushed into it hard.
Some of them probably were. And the thing is, you had asked a question about my grandfather and how much did he know and did he support the Nazi regime. I think he knew some things, and I wish I could call him back to find out how much. I'm sure he would give me some very honest answers. But also, let's not forget, the options were Germany or the Soviet Union. And for my family, the Soviet Union was out because the Soviet Union would annihilate them. So after they arrived on the island of Usedom, where Peenemünde is located, that's where they first arrived by ship. And then they were sent to occupied Poland. Now, half of Poland was occupied already by Germany. The other half was occupied by the Soviet Union. And they were sent to the occupied German part, but way too close to Soviet territory for my grandfather to be comfortable. So they first arrived in Posen, then in Litzmannstadt. I have photographs from Posen, where they're sleeping on straw in an unheated barracks with horrible food and just terrible conditions. But then in Litzmannstadt, my grandfather was ordered to find work, and there was nothing in line with his technical capability. So the regime then sent him to Berlin. They found out about his capabilities. They drafted him, and they sent him to Usedom. But people were caught having to choose one side or the other. It was a matter of survival. And if you couldn't escape to Great Britain or to America, my grandfather's dream, at a young age, he would lie on the hillside of my great-grandparents' farm.
Didn't many
And
scientists...
he'd look at a sliver of the Baltic Sea in the distance where ships were passing, and his dream was always the same. He wanted to be the captain of a ship bound for America.
Weren't there reports of people defecting when they had the opportunity, scientists, to America?
If he had had the opportunity, he would have left already after the First World War. But he needed sponsorship, and he couldn't obtain it. And in 1939, when the family had to flee Latvia, same thing. There were no opportunities for them to go to the U.S. If there had been, my grandfather would have jumped at the chance. So when he finally got the chance in the post-war years, 1952, he and my grandmother boarded a ship for America, and it was the first time in my grandfather's life that his future was no longer commandeered by any country in military service. I think it must have come as a great relief to him. And later, after my family immigrated to the U.S., thanks to the people in a little tiny town called Wakarusa in Indiana, USA. They sponsored our entire family practically for immigration, including 3 grandparents and my whole immediate family. And Wakarusa means knee-deep in mud to the Potawatomi Indians, but I know that to my family, it came to mean a safe haven and probably hub of the universe. A little community of 1,200 people, little farming community. So my grandfather also, and my grandmother, came to Wakarusa, joined us there. We had preceded them by about a year. But my birth was very unexpected. My mother was 8 months pregnant when they left Germany for Zurich, Switzerland on a very foggy, foggy day. And the plane wouldn't take off that night because of the fog. And I decided, neutral country for me. So I was born in Switzerland.
Oh, so this is definitely a work of love, obviously. And I'm looking at a photo of somebody with a German helmet. Is this somebody?
Yes,
in
that's
particular?
my father, Rolf. Rolf was drafted as soon as the regime, by the way,
Into
did
the
allow
Wehrmacht.
him to no, he was drafted into the Luftwaffe,
Oh,
the
Luftwaffe.
German Air Force, because of his
Sorry.
aeronautical engineering skills that he had already acquired. Now, as soon as the family was sent to Berlin, after they went to occupied Poland, and then were sent to Berlin, my father finally got word that he would be allowed to finish his aeronautical engineering education. And he thought, oh, thank goodness. I will pursue my education, and before I am done, this war will be over. Unlike my grandfather, whose engineering skills were always tied to the military until he came to the U.S., my father wanted no part of the military of any country. And so for him to be drafted into the Luftwaffe was devastating. As soon as he graduated, late 1941, he received his draft notice. And in 42, early 42, he started his basic training. And then, of course, there was still some years left in the war. So he served in the Luftwaffe, but fortunately, he was never sent on any combat or bombing missions. He was used to teach airplane design and the principles of aviation for a time to young recruits. Then he was sent to officers' training camp, which he flunked deliberately, he admits. And after that, he worked at an air base, retrieving crash pilots and planes. Toward the end of the war, he was sent for a time to fight partisans in Slovakia. The only photograph I have of him from that time, he's holding a little black kitten that he had rescued, and he's on a farm working in between assignments. I never thought to ask him, who took that photograph of you, Dad? It's a wonderful photograph.
Is it in the book?
It is, and I will send it to put on the show.
Sure.
But after that, he was given a choice of another assignment. He decided to sign up for navigator training, thinking this could take a year and a half or longer, and maybe by that time the war will be over. But at the very end of the war, March of 45, he and tens of thousands of other German troops were sent to the front.
The Russian front?
No, the Western Front, to fight against the Americans, the French, the British, whoever was left, not the French probably, British Americans. And at that time, though, they had no personal weapons left to give out, and my father's unit was soon told to disperse, which they understood as just leave the front, go homeward, do whatever. My father walked 160 miles cross-country in late winter toward home, where he last knew home was, because remember, no one knew. Was their home bombed? The family's homes on both sides were bombed, my mother's and my father's. On my mother's side, by the way, she and my grandmother were trapped in Berlin until March of 1944, because the word was no working person leaves Berlin. But my mother had obtained work in a small town northwest of Berlin that was much safer. So finally they were allowed to leave. But that was not until their apartment had been bombed, their building, in stages, until finally the 2 floors above them were totally destroyed. The walls and ceilings were badly damaged. The windows were shattered pipes were burst and water was flowing into the apartment. They could no longer live there.
Mm-hmm.
They lived for a time in a storage space outside the city because they had to continue to take the train into work every day in the center of Berlin.
Tell me about this little signet there, right here, this little award thing.
My book won a finalist award in the 2012 USA Best Book Awards in the narrative nonfiction category, which really surprised and delighted me because I self-published, and because I'm a graphic designer, I also designed the cover and the interior of my book.
A lot of history here. This is just rich with information. You know, when I look at documentaries, and I said this off air, that I've been going through a lot of the World War II, little Civil War, and some of the required reading that we had to do in high school. And, you know, it's amazing what people lived, the conditions and how they lived, what people suffered. I think about the Jewish people and how they really were just totally just treated like trash. It was, I've never, you can't comprehend that type of brutality. And and the contrast in how, and what was the mindset of these people that were running this? You asked yourself, how could a nation fall prey to this? How did this happen?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
because, you know, when I look at the German people, I mean, you look at German engineering, there's bright, brilliant people. They're not stupid. Something happened, and it couldn't have happened overnight. But this whole thing started, and once it got to that point where he declared himself chancellor, everything changed.
Yes, and also by that time it was really too late for most people to do anything.
And the key thing that you said,
And you could risk your life, and many did. Maybe not enough, but many did, and they died as a result.
I think one of the things that you touched on in our conversation off air was the fact that it's not necessarily those that resisted or those that were for it, but those that were rather ambivalent. And I'm using that word. They just did this.
Also, one thing to remember, and my mother knows this because she was born and raised in Berlin, she saw that the Hitler regime initially did some very good things for Germany. People were put back to work. All of the men who were unemployed in the local city park, which meant that my mother could no longer go there as a child. It was too dangerous. They were all put to work. And infrastructure was improved. Right. Everything improved in Germany during that time. Germany had been hit very, very hard by the Great Depression.
And
in my
what
mother's
happened
family,
is
that's remembered.
They all thought of this great new Germany, and everybody was believing the dream. And they thought they were living the dream until then it turned. The brutality in the war.
Yes, but also, remember, a lot of people didn't see that brutality
Right.
and didn't know about it. Now, my parents...
Soldiers actually brought some of the
said they
Germans.
did not know about the Holocaust, genocide, and the death camps until after the wars was over.
Right.
Now, the more reading I do, my initial mindset was, of course, everybody knew. How could they not have? But many, many did not. Now, there's a book that's on my suggested reading list entitled What We Knew, written by Johnson and Rubin. And according to what they come up with, about a third of the people knew everything. So people in the upper echelons of the military, the government, hospitals and institutions, and the church. Many people in the church knew. And there were sectors of the church that were very much opposed to the Nazi regime, were persecuted and killed for their faith and for their beliefs
Well, we ran
and
out
for
of
their
time.
resistance.
But the name of the book is Flight of Remembrance, a World War II memoir of love and survival by Marina Dutzmann Kirsch.
Yes.
I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
I really appreciate it. This went really fast. This is a cool book. There's a lot of stuff here, and if you're interested in history, I would highly recommend this book. Until next week, thanks for watching Gate City Chronicles. Thank you for watching Gate City Chronicles, and we want to thank our sponsor, Avard Cleaning. They've been a sponsor for quite a few years now, and we appreciate them being a sponsor. And if you want to be a guest on our show, contact accessnashua@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your story. Until next week, thanks for watching.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.